Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is John Finestor. I'm with Point Advisory. We're a full-service sustainability firm. I lead our natural capital practices. And I'm calling today from the Wurundjeri country, and I'd like to pay my respects to all leaders past, present, and emerging. And all of you from where you're calling to, I'd appreciate to hear where you're from, so please do use the chat function. We'd love to hear where you're calling from. I'm really pleased to be having this webinar. This is a part of our sustenance, the Point Advisory Sustenance webinar series, this one on science-based targets for nature. And I'm really happy to be joined by Tim Cronin from WWF. He leads the land restoration and protection area, and Jess McGlynn of the Science-Based Targets Network. She leads the corporate engagement program. And they'll be speaking in just a minute. I do want to start with a couple of introductory remarks. We've gotten sort of more registration for this webinar than we have for any of our sustenance series, and I think that's really a reflection of how we've come to view this subject of biodiversity and natural capital, and that we've realizing that making incremental changes or being less bad really isn't enough anymore. We really need to shift to really doing enough. And we have an easy way for climate, for greenhouse gases, for really defining what enough is for an individual company, but we haven't had that yet. We haven't had a way for doing that for water, for biodiversity, for land, and for oceans. And we're looking at those global boundaries and really what are those limits and how do you translate that into a corporate target? And that's really what this webinar is about and what science-based targets are about. And the vision for all of this is that we I just got a note here that my audio is not working. Can everyone else hear me? Just okay. Okay on my end. So what we need to do is the goal really here is looking at a goal of kind of 2030. We really need to halt the loss of biodiversity and natural systems. And by 2050, we really want to move to restoration and really moving towards a net positive area there. And what becomes obvious to any company that takes a look at this in a very serious way is that new business models are ultimately needed. So that as background, I want to hand it over to Tim and then over to Jess after that to give us some background on the state of nature before we introduce the Science-Based Targets Network and then SBTs for nature. So Tim.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everybody. I'm calling in from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. I'd also like to pay my respects to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of nature and introduce the science-based targets broadly. First of all, how is the planet faring? It would come as little surprise to most people on the line. The answer there, not particularly well. Next slide. Thanks, Sarah. So this is an image that many are probably familiar with. It points to planetary boundaries. I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on this particular aspect, but it is important to the science-based targets concept. As John said, it's really about shifting that mindset from, what can we do better? How do we make things less bad? To looking at what are the limits we need to get within in a planetary sense. And we've done that with climate change. We've seen the world mobilise around 1.5 degrees. We know what that means in terms of carbon in the atmosphere. And a lot of effort has been put into disaggregating what that means at company level, at national level, sector level. We want to do the equivalent for nature. It's not easy, but the planetary boundaries are a good place to start in terms of understanding what those limits are. What this image shows, and there's various versions of this one's a little bit out of date, but what this shows better than most is particularly biodiversity loss down in the bottom left there, that it is quite literally off the charts, and we've got a hell of a lot of work to do to bring it back in within this safe operating space. Next slide, thanks, Sarah. When we look at biodiversity loss, it can be difficult to measure. WWF releases what's known as the Living Planet Report every 2 years, and it uses the Living Planet Index as a really key proxy for the state of biodiversity, looking specifically at vertebrate species abundance. I think there's about 4,000 different vertebrate species that are measured and monitored and 12,000 odd populations. What we can see with the Living Planet Index is that it's absolutely headed in the wrong direction. And since 1970, we've seen about a 68% decline in biodiversity. We need to turn that around. Next slide. Thanks, Sarah. The flip side of that is looking at our footprint, our ecological footprint. Again, it would come as no surprise to most on the line that we are using far more natural resources than the Earth can naturally sustain. And what this particular footprint index tells us is that currently we use about 1.7 Earths. So we're getting to the point where we need 2 Earths to sustain our lifestyle, our standard of living, our production and consumption patterns. So we need to bring that below that line. So to me, this biocapacity line is a good way to think about nature in the same way that we think about climate. You know, is that our 1.5 degrees? Yes, it's complicated to break down. Yes, it's complicated to disaggregate to national level, to company level, but it's a good metric. How do we get 1.7 down below 1? Next slide. Thanks, Sarah. So what does that mean on the ground? Obviously, those indices they're pretty broad. They can be quite nebulous. What does this mean on the ground? This is a paper that was released last year, I think, from Bergstrom and a lot of other luminaries in this space that really points to 19 ecosystems across Australia that are showing explicit signs of collapse. So we're not looking at a situation with biodiversity loss, with climate change, with the interaction of these many issues, these many threats, where it's limited to the Arctic or the Antarctic or the Amazon rainforest or the Great Barrier Reef. It's virtually every ecosystem is showing significant signs of stress, and they're heading towards what we talk about as ecological tipping points, where things can really collapse. It's very challenging to understand and predict exactly what those impacts will be, but we'll talk a little bit about, you know, why business should care, which will come again as probably a little surprise to many on the call. Next slide. Thanks, Sarah. Look, if we look at pretty much any indicator of nature decline, biodiversity loss, in many ways it can be linked back to business, to industry. This is a report from the World Economic Forum, links species loss specifically to food, land and ocean use, infrastructure and energy and extractives, accounting for around 80% of all threatened species decline. So clear impacts from business on nature. Again, should come as no surprise. Next slide. Thanks, Sarah. A key kind of flip side, if you like, to that is there's been a lot of focus for many, many years on industry impacts on nature and ways to reduce those impacts. There's an increasing focus more recently on dependency upon nature. And I think that's a really critical aspect to think about in relation to science-based targets for nature, as well as many other different platforms and initiatives that are emerging. It's interesting to think about that interaction between business impact and business dependency. On the one hand, it seems perfectly natural and understandable and comes as no surprise that it's very much the same sectors. It's the usual suspects, it's forestry, it's agriculture, it's mining that show up both on impact and dependency. But if you think about that a bit more deeply, you know, you would think that it's those very sectors, those very industries that are most dependent on nature that would be most incentivized and most dedicated to protecting and conserving it. And yet I think that really illustrates, again, something that we're all probably familiar with, and that's a real disconnect in that the goods and services that nature provides, they're not accounted for, they're not valued in traditional financial and economic terms, so they're not factored within business balance sheets, profit and loss statements, cost-benefit analyses. And that's very much why we're seeing, you know, a decline of these natural resources right across the globe. Now, science-based targets for nature is not explicitly an initiative around natural capital accounting. It's not explicitly focused, at least at this point, on incorporating environmental externalities, but certainly, you know, I see it as one part of a broad movement in that direction. And I'd like to think that an outcome of this work as it evolves is that we do see far greater internalisation of those costs and benefits. Next slide, thanks, Sarah. So I think it's pretty natural if we've got a high impact on nature and those indicators are going down, we also have a high dependency on nature. It should come as no surprise that nature loss is increasingly being recognised as high risk. This particular chart, again, many may be familiar with it. It's a recent World Economic Forum report where environmental related risks account for almost the top 5. There's a note here that even the one key risk here that is not environmental related in this top quadrant relating to infectious diseases can actually be linked back to loss of natural capital. So it shows a dominance of environmental risks. And if you look back over the last 5 to 10 years of these reports, you can see in particular biodiversity loss sneaking up. I'm not sure if people can see my cursor here, but it's really snuck up over the last 2 or 3 World Economic Forum reports right up into this top quadrant. Again, a reflection of this high impact, high dependency issue. Next slide. Thanks, Sarah. It's not all doom and gloom. A lot of it is, but there's a lot of opportunity in this transition. As John said very early on, there are business and market-related opportunities in being at the forefront of this transition from old ways of production, old ways of consumption. And in many cases, there's little reward for sticking your neck up and being at the forefront of sustainability initiatives. But I think when it comes to natural capital and nature dependency, I think there is a strong business case for getting out in front of it. We can see some analysis here again from World Economic Forum, the economic opportunity well and truly in the trillions. The job growth opportunity is huge, particularly in the food and land use aspect. So as I said, a good imperative for business to get out in front of it, take a leadership position on this and not sit back and wait for others to define the solution. Next slide. Sorry, I'm probably getting over time here. I'll try and whip through. What can we do about it? So I don't have all the answers to this. I'm hoping Jess has all the answers to it. But what I've seen in terms of business solutions to nature loss, sustainability in the 10 odd years that I've been with WWF. Initially, there's traditionally been a really strong focus on commodities. What are those key soft and hard commodities having the greatest impact upon nature? This is an analysis from many years ago that underpinned WWF's market transformation initiative, where we linked off commodities to biodiversity loss across the globe. Most of the usual suspects here: palm oil, beef, timber, tuna, and we spent a great deal of time and energy focusing on those. That work has represented a really strong foundation of action and investment that can underpin a lot of work in and around the science-based targets. Next slide, thanks, Sarah. There's also traditionally been a really strong focus on priority places. So where are those areas across the globe that are most valuable to nature, most valuable to biodiversity, and most vulnerable, under the most threat? This particular image here is from a recent report from WWF looking at the deforestation fronts across the globe. Would come as no surprise, most of those deforestation fronts are across the tropics in the developing world. What still comes as a surprise to many is that deforestation is still occurring at a rapid rate in Eastern Australia. So a lot of our focus in particular, and the focus of the companies we've worked with over many years, has been on linking their operational impacts, their supply chains to these particular priority commodities and the particular geographic priorities across the world. And as I said, this is not work that Science-Based Targets is intended to circumvent and throw out. It's about building on this. As I said, there's been a huge amount of momentum, progress, action, investment, improvement across all these things, production practices when it comes to priority commodities, a lot of effort, particularly around jurisdictional approaches within these deforestation fronts and other biodiversity hotspots. But the Science-Based Targets is about reframing those things around the planetary boundaries. Next slide, thanks, Sarah. So taking it back to this, so how do we revisit the work that's been done, for example, through priority commodities, for example, that's focused on priority places, and how do we look at quantifying these ecological thresholds or planetary boundaries, particularly in related to biodiversity loss. What will current trajectories, or how far will our current trajectories get us? Probably not far enough, definitely not far enough. So how do we set some quantitative targets that actually can get us back within this safe operating space, rather than starting from the standpoint of what we're doing, do more of it? We need to turn that on its head, look at what needs to happen and work back from there. And again, I think there's a lot that can be learned from climate change, from 1.5, and what does that mean for nature? It's probably enough from me. Over to you, Jess, for all the answers.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for a great context setting of why this work is so important. Hello, everybody. I'm Jess McGlynn. I'm based in Washington, D.C. It's a pleasure to speak with you. It's my evening, your morning. I'm really excited to share a little bit about what we're doing at Science Based Targets Network, why it's important, how you might get involved if you're interested, and also provide a couple of case studies from some of the companies we're working with. Next slide. So this is the question that Science Based Target Network is endeavoring to answer right now. What can your company do today to align with the science to be nature positive, net zero, and equitable? And our answer to that are methods that will enable companies to set targets that will tell you as a company that you're doing enough of the right actions in the right places on the right issues to stay within an environmentally safe and socially just operating space. As many of you appreciate, we cannot solve the climate crisis without tackling nature, the nature crisis, and we can't solve the nature crisis without tackling the climate crisis. They're completely linked. Our work grew out as Science-Based Target Initiative for Climate, and we are extending the methods that they started on climate to all of nature. By nature, we mean specifically biodiversity, fresh water, oceans, and land. We're creating methods in each of these areas to enable companies to set targets. And our targets and methods are going to be aligned with global goals, both the SDGs and whatever comes out of the Convention on Biological Diversity. We know that there's a lot of nature initiatives that are out there right now. So we wanted to share this slide with you to explain that we are trying to also align with all these other nature initiatives. And we'll send you these slides afterwards. It's way too much detail to go through. But one of the things I wanted to point out in this slide is that Science-Based Targets for Nature is working across several different aspects of addressing nature issues, everything from assessing your impacts to prioritizing, to figuring out the targets, to taking action, and then to validating and measuring and reporting on your targets. And we know a lot of initiatives in nature do similar things to what we're doing, and we're building on what those initiatives are doing and aligning with those initiatives. And one specific one I want to call out is TNFD. We are a knowledge partner of TNFD. I know that a lot of companies are interested in what TNFD is doing. TNFD is very focused on disclosure, and we are working very closely with them to figure out the metrics for disclosure right now. Next slide. When I say we, I'd like to take a step back and show you who we are. We is actually a coalition of several NGOs. It's all the NGOs that worked on Science-Based Target Initiative and got that launched, and also the NGOs that you might be familiar with that are very active in the nature space, such as UNEP WCMC and IUCN. And we're also partnering with some of the industry coalitions and NGOs that work with companies on general sustainability issues, like the World Economic Forum and World Business Council for Sustainable Development. The value of having all these partners is that we are creating an aligned movement around what we're doing and trying to get agreement around what is the right level of ambition for companies to stay within a safe and just operating space. So our work is taking a little bit of time because we are trying to get alignment amongst all these different NGOs. However, at the end of this process, there will be a standard and methods that you can see are credible, rigorous, and that many NGOs stand behind. Next slide. We also are working with lots of companies all over the world. These are just some of the companies in our corporate engagement program. We set this program up last year in order to test our methods, our tools, and our guidance as we're developing them, because we really want to make something that's user-friendly, aligned with what companies are already doing, cost-effective, and we need companies to help test our products with us before we release them publicly. Next slide. We're also working with several industry coalitions, different like OP2B, for example, Textile Exchange, and several financial institutions for the same end. We're really trying to have end users test our products as we go. At this point, we've tracked over 90 companies that are getting ready to set science-based targets for nature in 30 different countries around the world. We have over 55 NGO partners working on a technical piece of our work. We've also established a referral program so that companies who want to get ready to set a science-based target for nature but don't want to join our corporate engagement program can work individually with a consultant. And this is all on our website if you want to go look afterwards. And we also have over 130 companies working with us directly in the corporate engagement program. So where are we at today with our development of our methods? We launched our initial guidance last year. You can find it on our website. That guidance provides an overview of the 5 steps one would need to take to set a science-based target for nature. We're currently updating that overarching guidance right now, particularly focusing on steps 1 and 2. We're also working on the actual methods that fit into that overarching guidance. And the first methods that will be released will be at the end of May. They'll be our freshwater methods, so stay tuned for that. We do release our methods in draft form earlier to our partners and our corporate engagement program members in order to get user feedback. So if that's of interest to you and you want to get in early on the game, let us know, and we'd be happy to have you as part of our crew. Next slide. Our entire framework is framed around the idea of pressures. So we as humans have pressures on nature. These pressures come from IPBES, from the IPBES report. So things like resource exploitation, climate change, pollution. We are going to help companies address their specific pressures on the different realms, which are freshwater and oceans and land. And we're also looking from an angle of the state of nature. So with respect to biodiversity, what species need, what ecosystems need, and nature's contributions to people. This is our framework, and I wanted to just go over it very briefly with you, the 5 steps to setting a science-based target for nature. The first step would be to conduct a materiality and value chain assessment. So the materiality impact assessment, I'm sure many of you companies have done some sort of materiality impact assessment for your sustainability reports. The way we're framing it is both your impact in nature and what nature needs in order to evaluate where you're having the highest impacts. We actually have a tool in our methods called the sector materiality tool, where you can just, whatever your sector is, you can go in and look and see, oh, these are the chief kind of pressures that I will have on nature upstream in my direct operations and downstream. That's the starting point. And we're asking every company that's working with us right now to get started on this, because it takes time to collect all the data that you need in order to understand your pressures on nature, figuring out what's going on with your suppliers, figuring out what's going on downstream. It takes time. So our methods won't be complete till the end of the year, but it's good to start now. The second step in our 5-step process is the prioritize step. So we realize companies have all sorts of impacts and dependencies all over the world, depending on what kind of business they're in. And you can't do everything at once. So we set up criteria in which you can figure out where to start and what to work on first in order to have the biggest impact. Step 3 is really where the rubber meets the road. That is where the methods come into play. That is where freshwater methods, land methods, biodiversity methods, and ocean methods start, basically. That is where we say what the ecological thresholds are, what your fair share of those thresholds are, and how to figure out how to set that target, that baseline, and then what the level of ambition should be for your company in order to address your impacts. Step 4 is the act step, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide because it's very important. And then step 5 is the track step. So that's the step where we're talking about monitoring, reporting, and verifying what you're doing. So it's very similar to SBTI's climate format, but only it's applied to nature. Next slide. So on the act step, step 4 for us, we use the mitigation or conservation hierarchy. I'm sure many of you are aware of what that is. We start with the idea of avoiding impact where you can. It's really important to emphasize this because it's much more impactful to avoid the impact than to skip right to regenerate and restore. Regenerate and restore could take years to do. So the best case scenario is just avoid the impact if you can. After avoid, then we move on to reduce. So if you can't completely avoid it, take steps to reduce or mitigate the impacts that you're having. Step 3 would be the restore and regenerate step. So that's all, like there's a lot of work we're doing with regenerative agriculture, for example, and that's a very important step for us as well. On the restore piece, that's really dealing with set-asides and protected areas and things companies can do to help protect areas that are that are completely set aside. And then step 4, the transform step, is really a huge step. That's something that you would do, an action you would take outside your immediate value chain. So that's things like advocacy for policies that enable sustainability, or R&D, or new business models that help you to decouple from extractive resources, for example. And so a company will be required to do different actions in all of these areas depending on what their impacts are. Next slide. We've been asked by lots of companies, what can we do now? We don't want to wait till your methods are done. Our leadership really wants us to take action on nature now. So what can we do? In response to that, we put out some interim targets. They're on our website. And it was areas that our technical team and the NGOs felt there was enough consensus globally around the level of ambition that we felt safe to say these are okay targets to start on that will be in line with what the methods will come out with. So we have one on deforestation, we have a couple on water, one on GHG emissions, and one on ecosystem regeneration. And the next slide, I want to show you a little bit about how these will look, the targets. So you'll see, and the reason this is important is that our actual targets when we get to the final methods will look similar to this. So I thought it'd be useful to walk through this for a second. You can see that here's a target on deforestation, zero deforestation. The action it's related to in that mitigation hierarchy is avoid. The target itself provides enough detail that you can figure out what do we mean by zero deforestation. And it comes with guidance to get into the nitty-gritty details of what that means, which will likely be required for a lot of the targets. And then we highlight the indicators in the final column. Again, this is something that any company can start with now. If you do start on this now, you will be in line with what we're going to ask for from our methods when they're complete. Next slide. If anything of this interests you, we would love for you to work with us. We have a lot of things to test still. Like I said, our freshwater methods are coming out in May. We still have other things to test with land and oceans and biodiversity. And so we welcome you to join us and work with us. And in our corporate engagement program, we ask for feedback on what we're doing. We give you the first look at our products. And we also have times where we share case studies amongst the group. So a lot of companies are trying different things out and they present to the entire group what they're doing, what kind of databases and tools they're using. And we find that that's been quite helpful in sharing and expediting action with all our companies. Next slide. Back to you, Tim.
No worries. Thank you, Jess. Before we get on to, I think after this, talk about a few examples, we just wanted to introduce our Science-Based Targets for Nature Australia New Zealand working group that has recently emerged late last year, many of which I hope are on the line and not going to pepper us with tough questions. Made up at this stage of a variety of NGOs and consultancy firms, all of whom can see this initiative, this opportunity emerging elsewhere across the globe, particularly Europe and North America, and see a great opportunity for testing and applying it here in Australia and New Zealand. As Jess said, we don't have all the answers, but we're keen to work collaboratively to find them out. So the group's currently made up of representatives from the Science Based Targets Network, Jess specifically, Point Advisory, ourselves at WWF, ACF, Pollination, Deloitte, Nature Positive, and Accounting for Nature. I hope I haven't missed anyone there. My apologies if we have. We do have an industry roundtable scheduled, not yet locked in, but earmarked for late March. That's going to be a fairly tight targeted group. Invitations are due to go out any day, but if there is anyone online that is particularly interested, then do please reach out to John and we'll see how space is looking there. We're hoping that industry roundtable will dive straight into some of the specifics and really start to look at practically, what can we do? What's the opportunity? What are the challenges? What are the barriers? And really formulate something of a strategy. So we hope that this particular webinar is a good opportunity as a broad kind of awareness raising of the initiative, and that there's an overlap between the people that are online today and those that join the industry roundtable, so we can kind of jump in and cut to the chase on the detail. It's probably more than enough on that. Back to you, John.
No, fantastic. Thank you both for your presentation there. I guess the one thing that does come to my mind in listening to that is water, and I don't think anybody on this call in Australia needs to have a lecture about water. But one interesting anecdote that I think is very telling is that we've actually changed the flows of water so much that we've changed time itself. So a lot of water actually flows from the poles down to the equator just by chance, and we've been building dams and reservoirs and diverting so much of that water that it's changed the gravitational center of the Earth, and as a result the Earth is spinning faster, the same way a figure skater would on ice, and we've actually had to reset the atomic clocks because of that. Every time I think about that, especially late at night, it bothers me to no end. But with that as background, let's talk about a few case studies here, and maybe Sarah, you could go to the next slide, and Jess, you could start with a few of yours, or maybe you can introduce this one.
Yeah, I just wanted to share one of our corporate engagement program members is LaPost Group, and they've been doing quite a bit of work on testing steps 1 and 2 with real life data. And so I wanted to share, Sarah, if you could pull up that video. It's disappeared. This is Muriel Bernoud. She's the ESP director. Okay, go ahead, Sarah.
In 2020, to participate in the co-construction of science-based targets for nature management guidelines, which could be a gateway to an SBT for resources and also lead us further in our journey regarding biodiversity. LaPost joined the SBT Network Corporate Engagement Program in January. We are now conducting the first steps of the SBT for Nature methodology. This nature-oriented process gives us useful insights to improve our environmental policy, for instance, by demonstrating how the different pressures on nature are all related: climate change, soil and water use, pollution, biodiversity, resource exploitation. After assessing and identifying our most material impacts and dependencies on nature, and where they occur in our value chain, we are now refining the prioritization of where we should act first. We also began to brainstorm with experts on what targets we could set in order to take action and do our part. We are proud to help develop methods, tools, and guidance by testing and providing feedbacks to the SBT network. We hope that our example as a major multi-business services group will be useful for a lot of companies.
Great. I just wanted to share that because I know this probably looks really complicated to some of you. And so we like to share examples of a lot of companies are already starting to do this and making good headway, and figuring out ways of making it less complicated, so that the next companies coming along will benefit from that. So that was the purpose of this. I just wanted to share what one of our companies is doing. And in the next slide, I also thought it'd be interesting to let you know about a case study that Bell Group did. They're a dairy food products company based out of the Netherlands, and they've been working with Metabolic and WWF on actually creating a proof of concept using our 5 steps in an actual landscape in the Netherlands. And they presented this a few weeks ago. You can see the presentation here in the final report, but it was really interesting. They figured out what their key dependencies were in a specific landscape, dairy landscape. Then they figured out what KPIs to use to address their key impacts. And then they looked at the literature, the scientific literature, and some of the national goals around different issues around nature to figure out what ecological thresholds to use and what percentage of their impact on the overall landscape was. So that was their baseline. And then they set a target around it. And then they created some action steps that were very specific to their business model to address that target. So some of the we were talking about avoid before, like overgrazing. That was one of the things that they introduced as a way of addressing their target. And then also some of the restoration targets that they put in there were like things around enhanced agriculture, regenerative agriculture practices. So that's just an example that I encourage anyone who thinks this is really complicated to go look at the report or go listen to the webinar and see how they approached it. It's not SBTN verified because it's a proof of concept, but it's going to be, it very much will look like what they did when we're all done. The thing that will be different is that we are supplying what the ecological thresholds are and how to allocate in a way that is scientifically rigorous and accepted by a lot of different scientists. So that would be one of the key differences from what they did. But just to share this with you, if you're interested, if this piqued your interest, go look at the webinar. Thank you.
Tim, do you want to go next?
Sure. Look, I'll just talk broadly about some of the companies I'm familiar with here. The first thing that jumps out at me with this is there's some real heavy hitters here. Some big companies with a long history of engagement in sustainability issues that are engaged on science-based targets and that see the business imperative for being there. As I touched on previously, my experience has been primarily around the commodity supply chains, approach and looking at priority places. There's probably 3 that jump out to me worth touching on. I'll try and limit to a minute each. One is Unilever. It's been at the forefront of sustainability action for many, many years. And I remember I think it was the 2020 Sustainable Living Plan or words to that effect, was industry leading, at the time. And what I really liked about their approach was a couple of things. One thing was at a high level, they would talk about doubling profits while halving the ecological footprint. So really refusing to buy into this false dichotomy that environmental conservation and economic development are necessarily trade-offs. Those 2 things can and should be inextricably linked, and by investing and driving towards ambitious sustainability or environmental action, they were not recognising that as necessitating a sacrifice or trade-off on the profitability and economic front. So I really liked that overall framing. The other thing I really like about what Unilever has done over a number of years is they tend to approach these issues in a pre-competitive sense, in that, if they're trying to transform, the production of palm oil or seafood or paper or any of the major soft commodities that they have an influence on, they realise that even being as big as they are and influential as they are, they still don't have the power to make those changes. That we've got really major wicked problems that underpin why palm oil is such a driver of deforestation, and the interaction of environmental and social issues. And so they realise that we need to work together collaboratively. We need to engage with others in these sectors to work through these solutions, to build a foundation of consistency, beyond which, of course, we can then seek to differentiate ourselves and position ourselves in the market. But at a foundational level, it needs to be a collaborative, approach to solve these problems. Another one that jumps out to me, I've got some experience or insight into, is Hewlett-Packard, HP. They've been a partner with our US office for about a decade, specifically focused on taking leadership positions in fibre sourcing, so forest fibre sourcing for their paper, and on climate emission reduction. They've really led the charge among many companies to commit to FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, as best practice forest management. And quite recently, they have put out a major new commitment that looks at their downstream impacts. So not just looking at, to use, climate change terminology, their scope 1, 2, and even 3 impacts for their forest fibre, but also looking now downstream at what is the impact of all the paper that is going through all of their copy machines, whether it's HP paper or not. That's led to a major expansion of the partnership, including with WWF, and major investment into forest restoration across the globe. So I think that kind of that downstream approach and accountability is really leadership in this space, and is an important aspect of science-based targets. The other one that jumps out at me here is April, one of the big bad deforesters from Indonesia. Them and one other company in particular have been responsible for tearing down much of the primary forest in Sumatra and elsewhere across Indonesia. They ostensibly turned the corner some years ago and have since been loud and proud on being deforestation free and strongly engaged in that agenda. So it's really it's good to see them here, but having had insight into the extent of impacts they've had across hugely biodiverse ecosystems across Sumatra, Kalimantan and elsewhere, I'm curious to see to what extent the guidelines and their action is going to pick up historical impacts, because I'm sure that's a familiar question across companies that are engaged in this. To what extent do I need to look at the impacts we've had in the past? What's the scope? What's the time frame? All these questions. I know we don't have answers to all those, but there's a lot of consistency in the questions that are being grappled with across this group. It's probably enough from me.
Great, thank you very much. And I'll kind of mention very quickly here before we move on to the questions. A lot of really good questions have come in. I'll talk a little bit about a company that I know fairly well, which is Mars, the global confectionery. And their journey kind of started way back in about 2014, 2015, and they realized that they really couldn't address these issues alone. Deforestation is obviously really important to their supply chain in coffee and cocoa. And they did an interesting report that you can get access to. We'll be happy to provide the link for you. And they tried to basically think about based on the current science they had back then, what would these science-based targets look like? And it's a really interesting discussion paper that talks about some of the different trade-offs and some of the issues that the scientific team behind SBTN is grappling with right now. And they settled on some goals that are actually very similar to where SBTN is headed now. And I think what's really telling about that is that they continue to make investments in data gathering. They recently worked with PepsiCo, and I think McCormick made a joint investment in a consultancy that was specifically designed to work in Latin America and Africa and work with their suppliers in getting the kind of data they need on water and carbon, GHG emissions and other issues. And that data issue is really critically important. And I think that's why a lot of companies are starting right now with this process of step 1 and step 2, even though the methods are still being developed, is because they're really it's a really critical issue. So Sarah, you can go to the next slide. And I got a lot of questions in the chat function there. I'll try and get to we'll try and get to all of them with the time we have left. Let me start with one that came in on science-based targets and existing regulations. So, Jess, I mean, a lot of companies have existing goals, existing targets, and obviously regulatory frameworks around the world they have to deal with. So how does SBTN really interact with that?
Yeah, so we will be taking into account local regulations, whatever regulations that the company's under in the target setting process. You'll see that reflected in the draft water methods that come out, the first ones out of the gate. We've also done a pilot of setting targets from the ground up instead of top down. So I should take a step back and say we are working with the Earth Commission. It's a group of scientists led by Johan Rockström, who's the godfather of planetary boundary science. We're working with them on thinking through things like thresholds and allocation. However, we completely understand you cannot go to a place and say, oh, Johan Rockström said this is all you're allowed to use. That won't work. And so we also need to have a multi-stakeholder process at the ground level where it's equitable and everyone has a chance to weigh in and figure out what the right way to go is. And we tried this out in the Atlantic forest in Brazil. And what we found was that some of the global goals were less ambitious than what the Brazilian government and the companies in the region had already agreed to. So that was an eye opener for us. We need to account for both local and national regulations and also what the global top-down science is saying. So that's a long-winded answer to say, yes, we will be accounting for that in the target setting process.
Great. And related to that, in terms of the materiality process that's recommended, or is it mandated, Jess, inside SBTN? Does that process, does it interact with other corporate materiality processes, or is it considered a standalone process?
Yeah, I mean, we have we've actually set up two pathways. One is the prescribed pathway, which will require companies to do X, Y, and Z in order to establish their materiality. But we also recognize that companies might not want to do that. They already have done a lot of work. So we've also enabled a flexible pathway on step one, as long as companies can prove that they've met certain criteria around the rigor of the methods that they've used. And the tools that they've used in order to come to their conclusions, then we'll accept that. Of course, this is all draft, right? So we have to go through a very rigorous process of getting all this approved. But as we stand now, we do want to recognize what companies are doing on the flexible pathway.
Great, thanks. And I think I'm going to keep on picking on you, Jess, if that's okay. We have more coming in. People are quite curious. So there was a question about trying to take a look at SBTI, and one of the comments was that that metric is fairly easy to figure out what the corporate responsibility is. Is that similar? Is there an attempt to make them as easy as SBTI, and what are the differences you've seen so far?
I mean, the big difference is obviously nature is place-based. Like, it matters where the impact is on the planet, and that means you have to know where your impacts are on the planet, and just that is tough. Like, some of the companies we're dealing with have very complicated supply chains upstream. They go through many layers of brokers and to get their raw materials, for example. They don't always know where their stuff's coming from. So that's the big challenge and the big difference with SBTI. I will say that our design criteria is to make this as easy and user-friendly as possible, but we can only go so far given the complexity of what we're dealing with nature. That's the big difference I see, the place-based nature of nature.
And I've been hearing with TNFD, which you mentioned earlier, and I know that SBTN and TNFD are working pretty closely together. And one of the discussions there is, can we just use organizational data, or do we have to get spatial data that really speaks to some of the issues that you're talking about? Is there a similar discussion inside TNFD?
Yes, and we haven't landed on a complete consensus yet, but we recognize there's a tension between getting companies into action now with imperfect data and getting the perfect data and getting it completely right. So the way our groups are handling it right now, they're coming up with models. The Land Hub, for example, is coming up with some models to enable a company to figure out what their impacts are, commodity by commodity, even without the spatial data. Of course, that will be very precautionary. The footprint will look much bigger than probably it actually is, but at least it's something to address the reality that it's really hard to get the spatial data. But we also are encouraging companies to get as spatially accurate data as possible in their supply chains. So, yeah.
And related to that, and this might be a little bit too detailed here, and Tim, you're welcome to jump in as well. And there was a question about, getting a single biodiversity metric or land metric or similar metric is difficult, if not impossible, to do, to have the same one. So how so far, or is it clear yet kind of where SBTN is falling on that?
I don't think we're going to have a single goal. I don't think it's possible so far. I mean, it's going to come down to the pressures. You can have a goal for a pressure, but to have a single overarching goal for all of nature, to me, seems like not possible. But we're going to try our best to line up with what CVD comes up with and the SDGs and frame our stuff so that it syncs with that, because we know a lot of the companies have commitments around those. And so we want to make sure everything meshes as best as possible.
Yeah, look, I don't have a whole lot to add to what Jess has said, other than to emphasise how important it is that SBTN is not about reinventing the wheel, that it's kind of bringing together and recognising what's already out there. A lot of the questions are focused on that issue of standardisation, consistency, indicators. Speaking from my experience, which is primarily kind of terrestrial ecosystems and a lot of focus on deforestation, one thing in particular that was explicitly referenced in what Jess spoke to is the Accountability Framework Initiative, and that's been in development for quite some years, and it's focused specifically on what deforestation and conversion free looks like. It's a good example of where we think it should be straightforward, deforestation free, no deforestation. What's the problem? But we all know that once you scratch the surface on these things, that definitions and thresholds, not to mention the equity and socioeconomic issues that Al Jones has, spoken to in his question there, comes into it. So there's been many years grappling with that and coming up with indicators and monitoring frameworks. And so rather than try to go through all that again, SBTN has explicitly kind of recognised or endorsed or proposes to endorse that approach. Now, I know that, forests and deforestation are just one of many issues when it comes to nature, but it's an important one, certainly in the terrestrial sense. So, in the short term, you can look at things like forest cover or habitat or vegetation, as a proxy for biodiversity in very broad terms, and progressively, build in more specific and resource intensive measures like species abundance, that we look at in terms of the living planet. So I think it's got to be an iterative thing, and it's got to recognise and bring in the depth and breadth of work that's underway.
And the only thing I would add to...
Oh, go ahead.
There you
John.
go. The only thing I would add to that is that with the emergence of natural capital accounting, one of the things we've learned from that field is that you actually can, if your data is collected in the right way, in the right spatial format, you can actually compare and reconcile different metrics from different geographies based on those local metrics. You actually don't need a single metric to make some good comparisons. But Jess?
Yeah, I wanted to speak to two issues. One was the issue of integration. That's something I failed to mention, is that we are aiming to integrate stuff for you guys. And what I mean by that is that, for example, you would only have a small set of indicators you'd have to measure to get the big bang for your buck. So right now, our land team they have 7 land indicators, and they're looking at incorporating carbon and biodiversity and nature's contributions to people into those 7 indicators, and then condensing them to a smaller group of indicators that you would be required to set targets around. I wanted to share that mentality that we're having. We're really trying to integrate stuff. And also that comes into play in step 4, the response or action step. We want to incentivize actions that have multiple benefits, co-benefits, say for land and for climate, for example. And also, we want to incentivize actions that do support local communities and respect community rights. And so some of these questions are way ahead of where we are on our methods, to be honest, but just in early speaking, when we talk, for example, on the land methods and the response actions, we're thinking about having different actions customized to wherever you sit on the value chain. And so that those that are downstream, part of what they would do would be to support financially their producers upstream in sustainable agriculture, just to give you a clear example of the way our teams are thinking about this.
There's also a question about governments and can governments use this? And Jess, I'll ask you to kind of chime in on that. And I will say that there has been some work done in Sydney as well as in Melbourne to be a part of some of the initial discussions with SBTN. So it's there. But Jess, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, our initial mandate was to create methods for both companies and cities to set targets. We don't have funding for cities right now, so that was the only government piece that we had explicitly in our method development. So right now we're completely focused on companies, but I do think there are applications that a country level could use when our methods are done, for example, around indicators and around landscape approaches, because we are going to try to incentivize that also, like multi-stakeholder landscape approaches where governments would have a very important role to play. We're just not there yet, so I can't speak articulately about that yet because it's in the future.
And there was a question about ISSB in the chat, so the International Sustainability Standards Board. So there's basically under the FSB Foundation, I believe it is. There's a new group that's been formed to really develop these methods for the nature-based sector and for accounting. And I was on the CDSB Biodiversity Working Group that helped put that recent guidance together. And much of those staff have moved over to IISB, and I can say that there are places in that guidance where SBTN drops right directly in. They look at dual materiality, which is also where GRI is going, and the discussion of targets was brought up as well. And SBTN was discussed at length in those groups and reaching out to them, as well as TNFD, and making sure all those things are in alignment. Something different than where I guess the community was 10 years ago and working in different camps. So I think the answer is working towards those ends. It should be completely compatible and designed to work together there. Jess, did you want to add anything or?
No, I mean, I am aware that we're aligning with the initiative called Align. There's a bunch of initiatives around accounting for nature that we are aligning with or trying to. It is difficult because there's a lot of different things happening right now. We have a really small team, but we're doing our best. And actually, we rely on partners like you to bring stuff to our attention so we can get plugged in where we need to. Great. So thanks for raising that. Yep. Okay,
and then one last question, and Sarah, I might ask you to bring up the last slide at the end there, so everybody has their contact details because we're coming to the end here. But it was around the finance sector, and is SBTN thinking about that? And is there a way for fund managers or investors to integrate SBTN into their investments?
Yes, we first of all, we do allow asset managers to join our corporate engagement program, and Church of England was the first asset manager to do that, and we have a few now, so that's a possibility. And we also have an FI working group, and we have somebody leading our FI work. And so if you're not an asset manager but you want to learn more about that, just give me a shout and I'll hook you up with her to discuss potentially engaging with us.
Great. Well, Jess and Tim, thank you both very much for coming today and sharing your knowledge. I really enjoyed the presentation and great questions. We're all available for follow-up questions, so please don't hesitate to reach out. And as I mentioned in the chat, we're going to be making this available on our website as well as emailing it out to all the attendees. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Thank you.